Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Graham Wilson, and I'm the director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. And I want to thank you for your interest in our work. I want to thank you for coming on this beautiful day after all of those weeks, months, as it felt like years of snow, ice, and cold, to give up the sunshine and come and hear. This report is a tribute to your determination to find out about what's happening about cities today, and we very much appreciate that degree of interest. The Initiative on Cities was created 4 years ago by myself and Mayor Thomas Menino when he stepped down after 20 very distinguished years as Mayor of Boston. And Mayor Menino unfortunately passed away not long after joining us, but he made a mark on what we do that endures to this day. And one of the things that perhaps would have surprised some people to know about him is that one of his top priorities for the center is that we engage in quality research. He said right from the get-go, that's what we need to do, and that's what we have been doing with the Menino Survey of Mayors named in his honor, and with the subsidiary reports like the one that we are here to hear about today, Cities Joining Ranks. I want to thank Citigroup and the Rockefeller Foundation for their support. Quite frankly, none of the work that we do would be possible if it was not for the support that we receive from Citi and from the Rockefeller Foundation financially. But as I always like to say, because it's true, that what has emerged is a community that links us, and that our colleagues from Citigroup, such as James Alderslade and Ryan from Rockefeller, have been important sources of ideas and suggestions for future work, and not just sources of money, much although the money is very much appreciated. So we enjoy working with you. We value both the money and the input that we get from you, and working with Citi and Rockefeller has indeed been a pleasure. Cities Joining Ranks is a collaborative achievement that evolved out of the Menino Survey of Mayors, national survey of mayors of major cities in the United States, first of its kind, developed by our office 4 years ago, and it stands as the only scientifically rigorous and representative survey of mayors in the United States. And we're particularly pleased today to launch this report on the networks that cities belong to, because this is a vital and neglected topic. One of the things that you'll notice if you follow cities is that cities have been increasingly stepping up to address problems that, in the view of many of us, have been neglected by federal and even state authorities. Topics such as climate change, gun violence, social deprivation. But the mayors have not been stepping up to tackle these problems alone. They have been joining hands, believing that they are stronger together on these topics if they work in networks than if they just pursue those praiseworthy goals individually. And yet, I think both in academia and more generally, why mayors join those networks, what they get out of them, and what they hope for when they sign up for those networks has been underexplored. So I think the report that we have today, Cities Joining Ranks, is a really important contribution of importance to people in cities, people who write about cities, and people in the academic community who study cities and also who study networks more generally. I want to thank the team at Boston University who've worked so hard on this report, particularly Kathryn Lasky, our executive director, who, as you will gather from that title, has many responsibilities in addition to working on this report, but has done a brilliant job on spearheading our work on it and in the writing of it. And Nick Gunkel, our research officer, who has brought a fresh and vital set of skills to our organization that have made a huge contribution to what we can do at the Initiative on Cities. I also want to thank the authors of the Menino Survey of Mayors. This project, this report, grew out of a section of the report on the Menino Survey of Mayors for 2017. We launched that report in Washington, D.C. in January, and we're pleased to have with us today David Glick, who is one of the authors of the report on the Menino Survey of Mayors, along with his and my colleagues, Professors Katie Einstein and Max Palmer. So their work is also very much appreciated and laid the foundation for the report that we'll be hearing about today. So we hope that this report will be of interest to you. We hope that all the activities that we engage in, both conferences and reports, will attract your attention. Please visit our website, bu.edu/IOC, and keep in touch with what we're doing and continue to watch that space for future reports and activities. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jamie Alderslade, who is from Citigroup, from the Communications Policy and Research and Community Development section of Citi. He leads Communications Policy and Research for Community and Development and the Inclusive Finance divisions. So I mentioned before, Jamie has not only been a financial supporter, but has been somebody who's given us terrific guidance and input on both the content of the questionnaires that we developed for the report, and also on ideas for the development of the initiative on cities more generally. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Jamie.
My pockets are empty. Nice try, though. Thank you, Graham, for that nice introduction. Some of it's true. And good afternoon, everybody who came today. I want to echo Graham's words about this is such a stunning day, so we really appreciate you all being here, making time to be here, and for those on the live stream, taking time out to be with us here too. A special thank you to Ryan Whalen and colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation. Tremendous colleagues, not just as funders, but as Graham said, as thought leaders, as partners, as in every sense of the word. And thank you for joining us on this journey and understanding the insights and strategies of the nation's mayors. I also obviously want to thank the Initiative on Cities, they're just wonderful partners. Their commitment to academic excellence, to partnership, to pushing the envelope on some of the big issues is remarkable, and it's such a joy to work with them. So thank you both for being such great partners. I'm going to be brief because, as people will attest, I can go on and on and on and on, and today really is about the research. But this truly is a wonderful, wonderful report. I read it again over the weekend. We've done a few reports with IOC, and I think this is the best. I think it's going to have a real impact over the long term, over the way we think about how cities organize themselves and partner with each other, and what implications that means for all of us. There are tons of new data, but the conclusion is overwhelming. And I'm going to paraphrase. I'm so glad Graham didn't say this, because this was my line. I'm going to paraphrase two of our greatest philosophers from modern times, Aretha Franklin and Annie Lennox. Cities are doing it for themselves, and they really are. And why not, right? If you think about the US and Britain, Spain, the EU, the Middle East, there are all sorts of heated debates and rhetoric about borders and national identity and the nation state, what it means to be independent, yet part of a global society. Very difficult challenges to reconcile. Yet as these debates rage on, trillions of dollars every day, capital, labor, trade, pass through transactions every single day. And in addition to those kind of driving features of globalization, we have the negative components. Graham's mentioned climate change, and these ignore state, national, and geographic borders and affect all of us, not just Americans or Africans or Europeans, but human beings. We're all affected by these things. I don't know if any of you saw that in London they have got these pods now where you can actually walk into the pod and experience the pollution that would be in another city. That's how connected we are. We're actually living some of these issues, and cities are driving that agenda. As the earliest thinkers of globalization, like Anthony Giddens and Saskia Sassen said, cities are the hubs and nodes in an economy that's global by nature, but increasingly always local by impact. And Today's report shows that these networks of cities are also webs of solutions, idea exchanges, and collective action. At Citi, we take that seriously. I don't know if you know, we hear all of the debates, and it's heated and it's lively, to say the least, about immigration reform. But did you know that in this country there are 9 million legal permanent residents, I was one of them, who are eligible for citizenship, most of whom are low income and haven't gone the extra mile to become US citizens. If they do that, according to the University of Southern California, if everybody naturalized who was eligible to, that would constitute a $52 billion boost to the national economy. And for those on low incomes would translate to a $3,500 boost to their income in only 2 years. So naturalization is important. In partnership with the mayors of New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, we developed something called Cities for Citizenship that is about promoting eligible naturalization for immigrants across the country. So that as they build, many of whom have no credit histories, so as they build a new financial identity, they're building a new national identity at the same time. This has grown now to 42 cities and counties across the country, and in turn has helped thousands and thousands of people achieve their goals and their financial goals through citizenship. Last week, Citi Foundation, 2 weeks ago, the Citi Foundation hosted colleagues from C40, the network of cities, on new financing initiatives. And dozens of cities came across the world to speak about those issues. So at Citi, in closing, at Citi, we believe that these reports have really stunning implications for how we govern, for democracy, for governance, for what it means to be a citizen, for how we finance progress, and how we collectively harness opportunities and address challenges that supersede traditional borders. So we're truly thankful for the work that IOC has done, for our partnership with Rockefeller, and that's enough for me. So enjoy the presentation, and I'll be here until the end if you want to have a chat. Thanks so much.
Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Ryan Whalen, Managing Director of Global Partnerships at the Rockefeller Foundation. Ryan focuses on developing the Foundation's cross-sectoral partnerships with the public and private sectors, as well as managing its global program team. Prior to joining Rockefeller, Ryan worked in senior capacities in New York City Hall, the United States Senate, and on political campaigns in city, state, and national politics. He served in the office of New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg as Chief of Staff for Governmental Affairs and Communications. Before that, was Special Assistant to Senator Charles Schumer. Ryan, thank you for hosting this event today, in addition to everything else you've done for us.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Jamie, and to all of you both here in the room and on the live stream. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Rockefeller Foundation and to have, I think, what will be a really exciting and insightful conversation about the power of city networks. Cities are hubs of innovation, and we at Rockefeller have long believed in the power of harnessing networks to support cities in addressing their most pressing challenges and leverage their most promising opportunities. As part of that vision 5 years ago, we launched our 100 Resilient Cities initiative, creating a network of 100 cities around the world to address the shocks and stresses of the 21st century. Since then, we've supported mayors and chief resilience officers, not only to develop and implement resilient strategies in their own cities, but also to learn and to innovate together. This ability to share, collaborate, and advocate through the 100 Resilient Cities network has allowed cities to uncover new solutions to problems and build on the experiences of their peers. And it's through this work and more that we were eager to support the Boston University Initiative on Cities to create this year's Menino Survey of Mayors across a broad range of pressing issues, from affordable housing, climate change, and the challenging budget context at the state and national levels. The survey has provided key insights and perspectives into how mayors see the challenges faced by their communities. And the new set of results that we'll be talking about today, how cities are working together in networks to unite around common causes, are quite compelling as Jamie and Graham shared, and we hope will spark further action and innovation so cities together can achieve shared goals. Thank you to the Boston University team, to Graham and to Kathryn for your leadership of the survey and of the initiative, for Stacy Fox for all your efforts to make today's event and many more a reality, and to Jamie and the team at Citi. Thank you for your partnership in supporting the survey. I believe that for all of us, Boston University, Citi, and Rockefeller, this has been a rewarding and insightful collaboration and a partnership that we are incredibly proud of. So thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
I'm going to introduce the three people who will be at the table and then hand over to Kathryn, who will be handling the question and answer session. Kathryn is our founding executive director. She has achieved so much with the initiative on cities and for the initiative on cities. I think that the wisest thing somebody like me can do is to make sure they don't get in the way of great staff. And Kathryn has really been that great staff in terms of defining goals, projects, and supplying incredible amounts of energy for everything that we do. The best decision that I made as a co-director with Mayor Menino was to agree immediately to him bringing Kathryn over from City Hall when we founded the Initiative on Cities. She was a policy advisor to Mayor Menino there, where she led his work to make Boston the first city in the country to make pay equity for women its major goal, a major goal. In addition to creating the Mayor's Women's Workforce Council, she co-authored Boston Closing the Wage Gap, identifying evidence-based interventions employers can take to close the gender wage gap. As you will have noticed, those topics have increased in prominence and importance in the years since, and I think it says a lot about Kathryn's leadership capacity that she was highlighting those issues before they became so popular nationally. Nicholas Gunkel is the co-author of the report and a research fellow at Boston University's Initiative on Cities. Prior to joining the initiative, Nick completed his MPA from the London School of Economics, focusing on environmental policy analysis and climate adaptation. He previously worked at a UN internal oversight body and a social business in Malawi. And finally, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, David Glick. David is somebody who is really an exemplar of what I value in faculty, which is to say that he is of great achievement in research, numerous publications in the top academic journals in the country or indeed in the world. But at the same time, and I love to make this point when universities are criticized over this so much, he is not only a great researcher, he's a great teacher. And if you go around Boston University, you will find many, many undergraduates who will be eager to tell you about the great experiences they've had in his courses, one of which, taught with Professor Katie Einstein, is a very innovative course built around the series The Wire. So it's a pleasure to have him and a privilege to have him as a colleague, as well as one of the co-authors of the Menino Survey of Mayors. So that's the introductions from me. It's my pleasure now to turn it over to Kathryn.
Okay, thank you. I don't have a lav mic, so I'm not used to being stuck behind a dais, but it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today, and thank you again for joining us. I'm Kathryn Lasky, Executive Director of the Initiative. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you to the whole IOC team. I think anyone who's ever published a lengthy report knows that it's just a relief to have it out in the world. So thank you for being part of that. You know, this is not anxiety-inducing. It really just is a major relief. So it's a 36-page report in front of you. My job is really to break it down into kind of the key findings and key details. I'm going to run through a presentation of about 30 slides. I hope we'll take about 25 minutes. Bear with me, but it's going to be pretty straightforward. And then we're going to lead to Q&A. So I'm going to invite Nick and David up with me to jump into that, and we'll take questions. So with that, I thought I would start with a quote from Ben Barber, the late Ben Barber, author of If Mayors Ruled the World, who really was a firm believer in the power of cities to come together and the importance of cities and mayors coming together, who said, cities once favored walls, but even when under siege, never allowed themselves to be defined by borders. Their natural tendency is to connect, interact, and network. And indeed, that sort of relationship connectivity is totally critical and central to all of the networks and how they operate. But there's another piece that mayors will talk about when they say working together significantly increases our impact. We share and often outright copy each other's ideas. And it's one of the things over the last few years of talking to mayors that's always struck me is they are shameless about stealing ideas from one another. I mean, think about CEOs, right? CEOs wouldn't go out and say, this is what we do. Of course, we're going to take trade secrets from our competitors. Whereas mayors will inevitably talk to you about an idea that they picked up either from a peer city down the road or a city across the country or in a best practices trip when they went somewhere overseas. So that was part of our motivation is inevitably if mayors are looking to networks as sources of ideas and inspiration and this sort of collective power, we were interested in better unlocking and understanding what the networks are doing. But there was another thing that motivated this research, and that is that we sit in a university, and we are in that university at a time when a lot of issues that our faculty are deeply invested in, the momentum has been lost at the federal level. And so our faculty were coming to us and saying, I am deeply invested in urban climate mitigation. I am deeply invested in gun violence. Where do I plug in? How do I help? How do I take this deep evidence base that exists in the universities and make it available and accessible to cities? And inevitably, you can do that on a one-on-one relationship, but we were also interested in networks and the opportunity networks can afford to be conduits for a lot of that best practice, and that knowledge is actually coming out of universities. So there was an ulterior motive in this work beyond sort of the notion of policy diffusion, what scholars talk about as policy diffusion. 3 questions were guiding the work. 1, how do the networks in the US compare to one another? How is We Are Still In different from climate mayors, different from the C40? Which cities are actually joining which networks? And why? Why do mayors actually report that these are things that they think are important? These are outside the boundaries of their governance structures. Why do they actually commit to these external commitments, these external pledges? This is what we're going to talk about. I'll take you through very briefly the methodology. We'll do a profile of the city-to-city network. So we looked at the benefits, an understanding of typologies, network visibility, which ones are known in the press, network connectivity, how do they actually relate to one another? And then we'll characterize the participating cities. So which mayors are actually joining which networks? Why are mayors, why do they tell us that they're in these things? And then city connectivity, how do cities actually relate to each other through their network membership? And then lastly is a checklist for cities and a conclusion. And I want to say actually, everybody says, you write this report, you put it out in the world, who's the audience? And one of the things that struck us in this process is that there's actually many audiences for this type of knowledge. There's the networks themselves, there's the funders of the networks, there's academicians, there's the cities. It really is interesting to have had so many conversations with so many folks and really get a sense of everyone is actually interested in this topic because so much focus is being placed right now on cities and how to make sure that what they do is really best in class and how to make sure that they're all doing the right things on the ground. Okay, methodology. We looked at 15 active national and global policy networks with strong US membership. Our Menino survey focuses on the US. We were specifically focused on ones that had a strong preference in the US, knowing that many of these, about half of them, are global in nature and the other half are domestically focused. 10 have a core focused on environmental issues. There has been so much momentum in the environmental space. Inevitably, our sample skews to environmental networks. However, there's a lot to be learned across all of these different networks, regardless of their policy domain. So there's 5 others pertaining to different urban policy areas: Mayors Against Illegal Guns, Cities of Service, Welcoming America, Cities United, and Next Century Cities. I know both that there's a bunch of folks from those networks in the room, and also that there are folks who told us they're tuning in online. So thank you to all of you who took the time to speak with us, and more importantly, thank you for the work that you're all doing. 15 is a lot, so we tried our best to be exhaustive. We realized we didn't cover every single policy network that exists in this country, but we think this is a pretty good first step at examining where there's a lot of momentum and activity in this country. What did we do? We very quickly, we used data from the Menino Survey of Mayors, so we asked 150 mayors across the country why they're joining these types of networks. We looked at network membership rolls as of January 15, 2018, whether they were publicly available or the networks actually gave them to us. We did interviews with network representatives, and then inevitably there was supplemental information from online sources. I will add that our analyses mostly focused on member cities with population over 75,000, even though a number of the cities actually have permit member cities from of smaller communities. But this was really because we wanted to align a lot of our data with our findings from the Menino survey. So let's get into the networks themselves. I cannot possibly read you definitions of 15 networks, so I'm not going to. I just want to say what's in the report in front of you and available online. What we tried to do for each network is just define in basic language, not brand language, not promotional language, basic language, what is the network, when were they founded, who are their members, and what are some of the things they try to do. And then we actually sought to develop a rigorous set of definitions so that we could compare them. So this is We Are Still In. For folks who don't know, it's a North American network of networks. It brings together cities, counties, states, regions, tribes, universities, faith organizations, and businesses that pledge to uphold the Paris Agreement. And then there's a range of activities like media outreach, coordination with the other climate networks. Their goal is really to try to sort of build the societal and political momentum around climate mitigation. Every one of the networks we reviewed, we have the same information in the report. Again, I'm not going to go into it. What we tried to do is actually do this comparative definition of who are their city members, what are the obligations of those members, is it open or competitive process, activities and benefits, how do they actually compare, and then what's their online media presence look like. So just as for contrast purposes, this is C40 relative to We Are Still In. You can see inevitably that the list of activities and benefits is considerably longer. And also that rather than being WASI as an open process, C40 cities is actually a competitive process, and they're restricted to member cities and sort of these proven city climate champions. So their member base, right, the folks that they actually allow in are substantively different and considerably different than the ones for someone like We Are Still In. As I said, if all I did was go through the 15 definitions, you would all be rolling your eyes at me. I am not going to do that. I'm going to dig into some of the details and comparative analysis we've done. So this is one of the things we looked at, again, for comparison purposes. How are they similar? How do they differ? If you are a network, probably would be interesting. The appendix actually has the definitions of all of these activities. If you're a network, perhaps think about, and I should actually, the networks were able to verify for us whether we got this right. But we were interested in, what do they really do? So all of them inevitably are focused on media outreach. Most are also focused on advocacy. Advocacy means influencing other levels of government, right? Speaking on behalf of their member mayors to national, federal, or global actors. Conferences, convenings, inevitably, the strict definition we have here is that they meet at least 2 times a year and that they're focused on their member staff and mayors. Best practices and case studies, inevitably, another, conferences, convenings, best practices and case studies, technical assistance, critical ways in which knowledge gets disseminated. The actual nature of the activity will vary considerably within the individual networks, but it's worth noting that most of these folks are externally oriented, trying to influence other actors on behalf of the mayors and bring cities together also to build local capacity and expertise and make sure knowledge is disseminated from one member to another. Least common we saw was actually awards. Inevitably, some of the cities do that where there's a badge or some other kind of external recognition or validation. And then some of the other areas we saw really interesting public-private partnership facilitation. Interestingly, less than half provide direct assistance, right? This is interesting for cities who are thinking about, does membership in a network actually come with access to a new pot of money? Or is it really access to knowledge and access to my peer group? Okay, what else? How else do they compare? Lots of scholars have focused on network typologies. There were 2 that we thought were particularly interesting in the context of these networks. The first, and this is, I should say, this is not an indication of value. One cluster is not more valuable than the other. They both play really important roles. This is specifically looking at the environmental networks. And we saw really 2 classifications of environmental networks. One are what we were calling the high hurdle networks. They tended, when you talk to the networks, they tended to value their smaller size. They valued the opportunity to bring together the most aggressive or ambitious cities, particularly in relation to climate change. And this contrasted with the big tent networks. The big tent networks actually valued their size. So they valued how many mayors they were bringing into the fold, how many cities they could bring along. And by bringing in both the most ambitious with perhaps the newcomers, some of these folks, like climate mayors or We Are Still In, basically said, we're starter networks. We're ways for cities and mayors to signal their commitment to these issues without actually having to make a firm commitment, a data reporting requirement, some kind of agreement that we know they then are going to have to put resources and time and energy and money against to achieve. Yet, all of these things, we think, operate as part of sort of an ecosystem. So if you can bring cities into the fold through things like climate mayors and We Are Still In, are there opportunities and avenues for them to kind of migrate up and join, say, the Under 2 Coalition, which is bringing cities together with state and national actors that are really focused on deep decarbonization. The other distinction, when you compare the networks, that we were fascinated in is in relation to their origin stories. It's remarkable that all of us have been talking about cities as incubators of policy, but in fact, mayors themselves have been incubating policy networks. Now, I knew about and was motivated, to understand this area because of folks like Mayor Menino, who came together with Mayor Bloomberg and formed now a number of years Mayors Against Illegal Guns. Great organization. I hadn't worked on it personally when I worked for the mayor, but I knew the staff members who did. This is unusual. Because think about all the other demands on a mayor's time and all the other demands on their staff time and their governance boundaries, right? They are focused on their city and improving the quality of life of their city. So the fact that they're saying there is a knowledge deficit out there, there's a resource deficit, I should go build this new thing with my peers so that I can share ideas and I can also learn from them. And this really struck me, the fact that 8 of the 15 networks we looked at were initiated actually by mayors for mayors. Visibility. So another point of comparison, again, this is specifically focused on the environmental networks. This is actually showing you between 2010 and 2017, if you index web pages for the 7 largest online media publications, you see the change over time in media coverage of the environmental networks. So what you'll see here is that the C40 actually enjoys the largest share of media visibility. We Are Still In is the purple one, which is just below them. So again, that was created immediately in reaction to Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord. Major uptick in media outreach. But overall, there's a trend line here, right? Overall, what you're seeing in recent years is actually that all of the environmental networks are seeing an uptick in media coverage. We were interested in this because if they all say they're doing media outreach, are they actually competing for share of voice? Or in fact, are they all kind of, are they both creating momentum and building momentum for these issues and for the local activism that is actually happening on the part of cities? This is the same chart actually featuring over time, but again, remember this, where this was. So small relative number of mentions, but this is actually showing share of voice. So we were interested in, to what extent are the networks actually competing with one another, or are they, as I said, actually growing and increasing media coverage of local activism on the environment? C40 is the largest at the bottom, ICLE is at the top, and then the purple up here on the upper right is We Are Still In. And then lastly, also in relation to the environmental networks, this is just an index of network connectivity. When we talked to the networks, we were really interested in wanting to understand, I'm not going to quote anyone, wanting to understand, are they actually all competing with one another? Or do they feel like there's this symbiotic relationship and actually they all kind of have carved out their unique niches and they all fill a relevant role? And for the most part, what we found was yes, actually everybody feels like they fill an important niche, they serve a particular audience, and that most of the story was a story of collaboration, not a story of competition. And what this shows is actually online references, just as one measure of the frequency with which they're referencing each other, where they're not competing again, but they're actually having these mutually beneficial references to each other on their websites. We also talked to some people where we heard things about formal MOUs that are being signed. Other things in the spirit of cooperation was trying not to schedule events with the same mayors at the same time, trying to attend one another's conferences, really trying behind the scenes to have sort of, again, this cooperative relationship. If someone's issuing a press release, they're all trying to promote the press release. So it was really, I think, enlightening to see the spirit of collaboration behind the scenes. So I'm going to get into the participating cities, who's joining what and why. So first of all, I think this is remarkable. 59% of all cities with populations over 75,000 are in at least one of the networks. Is this the new way of doing business? I mean, this is incredible to think that 60% of our sample of cities are actually in one of these 15. Granted, it's a little bit different when you look down at the bottom. 41% of our sample cities, collectively representing 66 million residents, are in at least one of the environmental networks. Still, we're not talking about activity that's happening around the margins. This is not like 10, 15, 20% of cities. This is remarkable that this many cities over 75,000, but this many cities are actually seeing value in these networks and joining them and signing on and making these commitments. 44 of the 50 largest cities in the country are in 2 or more of the 15 networks that we looked at. It's also probably a good reminder to the networks themselves, you guys all know this, cooperation is requisite, right? For the nature of the work that you're doing, lots of cities are joining lots of networks, and inevitably it becomes a conversation about how do you all work together effectively to have the most impact and not compete for time of staff and mayor's attention. That point is reinforced here. There's a strong correlation between the number of members in environmental and other policy networks. So if you look up the left, you'll see the number of environmental network membership. If you look along the bottom, you'll see other network membership. And you don't really see many cities in the upper left and the lower right, which means once a city decides that they are on board with combining forces, sharing knowledge and best practices, making these public commitments with their peers, they do a lot of it. Once they get into networks, once they're sold on the value of these things, then they tend to actually join many other kinds of networks. I don't remember, Nick, do you remember which is the one at the bottom? It's in 4. It's not labeled. Well, I don't remember which one that is. We can look it up. But inevitably also, you see a lot of the big cities up at the top where overwhelmingly the big cities tend to be the most frequent joiners. Inevitably, part of this is also that they just have staff capacity to do this kind of work. I'm not going to drill into this. I'm just going to call your attention to a couple data points. This is the 13 most active joiner cities, so the ones that are joining lots of stuff. For the most part, it's the bigger cities, but actually you'll see Boulder, Pittsburgh, New Orleans, and Berkeley are among the most active environmental joiners. It's also interesting to note, where there's commonality. So the Global Covenant of Mayors, we are still in, the Chicago Climate Charter, and climate mayors, they're all in all of those things. And then you see variation, again, to that point about the high hurdle networks, you see variation when you get into some of those more niche networks that are really focused on particular populations of cities. Okay, so if you ask mayors, why do you sign on? And you code their answers, this is what it looks like. Number one, mayors could give us more than one reason, but number one was actually expressing collective voice. So one mayor articulated this by saying you have strength in numbers and a united front. When we're all standing together, we're more of a force to be reckoned with. A lot of this is inevitably intertwined with the nature of activities of the networks, right? They're doing media outreach, they're doing advocacy level, and the good news is that is the number one reason that mayors cite as to why they sign on, because it gives them this strength in numbers, this opportunity to come together and signal to other levels of government largely what their priorities are and speak as a united front. But the second most cited, which is perhaps less well represented in some of the activities, is signaling to constituents. I actually had one mayor say, you would not believe the grief I got from constituents that I hadn't signed on to X network. And I had to say, but look, I'm in the photo. I'm in the photo. I'm right here. They just didn't get my name on the list of cities that had actually signed on. And this is what we heard, for better or worse, constituents feel like they have access to their mayor. And they feel like their mayor actually needs to signal their policy priorities, and one of the most important ways they signal their policy priorities is actually by signing on to these networks and making these public commitments and being part of sharing best practices. The third is inevitably, not surprising, sharing best practices of information. We also heard 14% of mayors talking about filling a perceived leadership vacuum. I should add, this question did not specifically pertain to the environmental networks. This was just generally why do mayors sign on to public networks and compacts. So it's interesting that a lot of them touched on this sense that they and their constituents and others are feeling like there's a leadership vacuum around certain issues like the environment, and they felt this obligation to step into that space. We also asked mayors about their perceptions of how much power mayors have to counteract the Trump administration on particular policies. So I'll take a minute to explain this. So what we did in this chart is we actually asked mayors, let me see, regardless of whether you agree with mayors who are doing this, how much can mayors do to actually counteract the administration's policies in relation to climate change, immigration, policing. We also asked about healthcare and education. So when you take the data of cities that are not in any environmental network and you compare it to cities that are in at least one environmental network, you find a statistically significant difference in their perception of mayors' ability to counteract the Trump administration. So this suggests a remarkable level of agency between joiner cities and non-joiner cities. You don't find the same distinction in other policy areas, on immigration, looking at welcoming American members, on policing, looking at mayors against illegal guns, and on policing with regard to Cities United. So for folks who don't know, Welcoming America is very focused on immigrant inclusion in cities and creating welcoming cities. Mayors Against Illegal Guns is focusing on reducing gun violence, and Cities United is focused on reducing violence against men and boys of color in cities. It's, to be clear, in the other categories, actually mayors feel a remarkable degree of agency, and there's no distinction between the joiners and the non-joiners in those networks. And also, to be clear, organizations like We Are Still In was created in direct reaction to the Trump administration decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord. This is not causal, but it's a really interesting correlation to look at the distinction between these two different groups. Oh, okay. This is a lot to take in on one chart. I'll do my best, and we can come back to it in the Q&A. So what this is a map of city connectivity. And what it's actually showing is clusters of cities based on their joining behavior. The intention is not for you in this room and for folks tuning in to take a lot away from this chart. At the moment, it's actually to spend a little bit more time thinking about where does a particular city fall in the cluster, and how does that cluster of the grouping of cities actually compare to another cluster. So if you look at, I can't step away. If you look at the orange cluster of cities, those tend to be cities that are part of Climate Mayors and We Are Still In. And if you look at the yellow cities immediately next to it, those are cities that have made a commitment through the compact, Covenant of Mayors, to publicly share their emissions data. So if I'm in the orange cluster and I'm thinking about making a public commitment, but I haven't done it yet, I can look to the yellow cities next to me, or I can even do outreach to those yellow cities to say, if that's the next path in my migration and my ambition of climate mitigation, who else is in there that I can look to get advice from? And as I said, we can come back to this. Okay. The last piece, we included this at the end because we talked to a lot of mayors, we talked to a lot of city staff who try to support mayors in making decisions about which networks to join. And so in the interest of that audience, we thought it would be helpful to include a checklist for cities. We're open to ideas if folks who are in networks feel like something is not represented here that is one of the reasons you hear from folks as to why they join. But inevitably, we think cities should ask themselves, what's the policy focus and how important is that issue to me and my constituents? What message does membership send to my constituents and other levels of government? Is my city able to compete for membership? Is it even open? Which other cities will be my peers? Is everybody else on the same trajectory? Are they sort of at that same level of ambition as I am? Can I engage with civil society or business? Is that important? Besides US cities, who else is in the mix? And is it important to me to be part of that peer group? Which pledges do I have to make as a member? How resource intensive are these commitments? Which activities and outputs do I have access to, and how important are those? How much press coverage has the network generated? This is one of many, but I just want to be clear that because all of the networks are focused on media outreach, and one of the reasons mayors join is because of this advocacy and signaling potential, that this is an important criteria to consider. And then lastly, how connected is the network to other networks? How well are they all working together, and how important is that to me? So, in conclusion, all the networks are engaged in media outreach. The majority are focused on advocacy, building local capacity, whether that's via conferences, best practices sharing, technical assistance, peer learning. Awards are perhaps the least common benefit. The majorities of cities in our sample are joining city-to-city networks. Environmental networks are a sizable minority. Mayors join because they provide strength in numbers, they act as a potent signal to their constituents, and they afford opportunities to share best practices and exchange information. Members of environmental networks feel more agency compared to non-members in counteracting current federal policies on climate change. And lastly, there's clear peer groups of cities with similar membership profiles, suggesting potentially new opportunities for collaboration and providing insight into potential membership trajectories. People are taking photos a minute. So with that, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A portion, and thank you again. It's been a real pleasure.
Mike? Okay, hello. My name is Lolita Jackson. I actually am the network person for climate for New York City. So I don't know who got interviewed. It may have been me, I don't remember. But I just had a question. If there was an examination of the level of activity for the cities within the network, so some are passive and some are much more active, and if there was sort of a typology where certain cities were much more active based on size and other determinants, just curious.
Thank you. We did not specifically look at the activity of individual cities. I will tell you that other researchers within BU are really interested in things like the nature of climate action plans that are being developed and the content of those climate action plans that are being developed by particular cities. But we did ask the networks whether they have participation criteria. And I would say they have varying degrees of participation criteria, from fairly strict, and if you're not really actively participating, then you're no longer a member, to it's just important that the city signal their interest, and if they don't do much, that's okay, because we're just trying to bring them along and get them up to speed on some of these issues. We didn't actually delve into the specifics of how many cities have met X threshold. Certainly some of the networks. 100 Resilient Cities is obviously very focused on whether the cities have developed their resiliency plans, and folks like the C40 are very focused on whether cities have developed their climate action plan. Yeah.
Hi, Andel Koster from What Works Cities. So thanks so much for this. This reflects a lot of what we've seen in our network of cities. I have a question of whether it came up in your research, the involvement of city managers. Most of the cities that we work with are city manager led, and we often find that the commitment both from the elected leadership as well as the city manager is really crucial for driving change in the city. So I'm curious to know what role they played in your experience.
Do you want to talk about that from the perspective of the Menino survey first? In our sampling pool?
Sure. So the sort of quick answer is largely because this came out of the survey of mayors. Most of our explicit focus was on the mayors themselves. So we don't have, certainly not the survey data. We don't have the perspective of city managers. I think we did get the sense sort of in talking to some of the mayors that, in some cases the network memberships they were in were ones of their choosing. Others were ones they may have either inherited from their predecessors or from city managers or other, so certainly for some of the smaller cities, it's they sort of indirectly probably come into the data, but we don't have kind of direct sort of survey response on the city manager perspective on these issues.
And perhaps to add one thing, I remember we had a lot of conversations with representatives from the city networks themselves, and ICLE USA, for instance, in our conversations, recounted that they interact with a whole lot of different officials across city government. So there are hubs which attract people from public works, people from the mayor's office, and this is a theme which runs through a lot of the networks. So it's not point person specific with like a town administrator, city manager, but often it's much broader.
One distinction you'll see, to the best of our ability, in the definitions of the individual networks was we tried to create a distinction between the ones who really focus on mayors, and the mayor is the member, like climate mayors, and the intention of climate mayors was to bring the mayors together and make sure they're talking to one another and elevating their own priorities and speaking with one voice. And then the other networks that are really coalitions of cities. And so it could be that there's multiple representatives from the city itself that's actually part of it. Individual networks, a membership to varying degrees, we don't get into it, but to varying degrees, membership is sort of ratified by a mayor, a city manager, a city councilor, and then to varying degrees sort of reaffirmed when there's a new administration.
Hi, I'm Mandy Eichert. I'm from C40. Thank you for doing this, because it's kind of like having a free therapy session, or at least you get to see where you are relative to your peers in the classroom and your development. So we're really looking forward to having a closer read. But I had two questions. One, I must say, I was lost on your colorful mapping of all the U.S. cities. So if you can maybe walk us through a little bit of how those cities are grouped. It looked pretty regional to me, and what that means then for cities that may be looking to move from a big tent to a high turtle and what high hurdle network, and what you see as the opportunities for cities to move in that direction, or whether all cities should move or not. And then my second question is, especially in the 10 environmental themed networks you looked at, were there any gaps that the cities particularly said, or that researchers had found is a gap in what city networks actually are providing in the environmental space? It looks like there's a huge opportunity for growth in other city-to-city networks, but I just wonder if the environmental space is kind of tapped out, or what you learned about that.
Yeah. So I'll let Nick take the first one, and then I can address the second one. Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with the colorful map. So if for a closer view, you can all look into the report on page 30 and 31. You have like a 2-pager of this cluster network. The idea behind this was to depict communities of cities characterized by a certain overlap, which we define as 2/3 in their membership in environmental networks. So the nodes are the cities. There is a link if two cities, Honolulu and Richmond, California, share at least 2/3 of their membership, then we have a link which expresses this. Cities are closer co-located if they have larger overlap in membership. That's basically the takeaway. The different colors come into play because we wanted to simplify it a bit and ran an algorithm which clusters communities of cities defined as being relatively tightly co-located, having a certain commonality, and this is gets very technical, but this is to be read as cities which express similar policy priorities or simply have joined the same set of great overlapping set of networks. It happens that some of this is a geographical representation as well. The coastal cities versus more central American cities, there's a reflection of this, which underlies general membership in environmental networks to some extent. On the left-hand side on page 30, the pink community or cluster of cities, as Kathryn mentioned, is like the C40 group. So you can see, especially for those individual cities which are further away from their community, that these might actually offer possible trajectories for these communities to develop further and to have additional memberships, which is exemplified by these cluster bridges, how we call them, who are further away. So this points to this, the final bullet point on our conclusion, that we want to also visualize trajectories for cities within their peer group. So we already expressed that you're similar. Now look at these cities which are sometimes on the other end of the country, who are very different in size sometimes, who exemplify that you can actually go on another trajectory.
And then in response to your question about gaps, I would say there's two considerations. One is if the big tent networks value being big and bringing in lots of folks with a relatively low bar for commitment, but the high hurdle networks value being small and most of the high hurdle networks are like the C40, you're sort of happy with the size you are and with the number of US cities that you currently have, which makes it hard for more cities to kind of come along that are really focused on deep carbonization and then know where to go as a partner to focus, sort of be part of that like-minded peer group. So I think that's one potential. If everybody in the high hurdle network wants to stay small and intimate, then what happens as folks move and mature and get more aggressive in their commitments? And then the second, I think, is geographic. So there's one piece of analysis we didn't touch on in here where we mapped all the environmental networks across the country and sort of geographic hotspots. And I think Texas and California are really the only two areas. Texas, maybe you would expect it. But in California, we really didn't expect to see so many cities with population over 75,000 that are not in a single environmental network. Given the activism of the legislature and Mayor Garcetti and Governor Brown, it's pretty remarkable. And really the distinction is between Northern California and Southern California and all the communities around LA. So to us, that suggests, and some of the networks touched on this, is there an opportunity to bring together like-minded peers across disciplines and silos at a regional level? So how can you connect local governments with big anchor cities, with the business community, with universities? A lot of universities right now, for those who don't know, a lot of universities are developing their own climate action plans and doing really groundbreaking work around climate mitigation based on their own footprint. So how do you actually bring together those folks and create sort of centers of excellence and knowledge sharing communities at the regional level? And part of that in places like Southern California, and kind of bring everybody else along that hasn't been as far along on this journey.
Yes, hi. My name is Eugene Zapata. I'm Director for Latin America and the Caribbean for 100RC. I have a comment and a question. The comment was that I was going also to mention the city managers. There's one of the oldest networks of city managers in the world. It's American, it's International City Managers Association. So I guess that's interesting also to mention. And one other network that I know in the US that wasn't mentioned is Sister Cities International. It's a very old network also, born in the US, that has been working a lot internationally. And my question is on the international part of your analysis. Most, if not all, of the networks that you have included in your report were born, created, pioneered, or launched in the United States by American mayors. And when you look at the report, and your conclusions point to the fact that yes, there is a rise in network activity and activism and militantism from American mayors. But in my experience, this has not happened beyond the United States frontiers. Like, American mayors have been largely absent from international and global networks worldwide, C40 being an exception and 100RC being an exception because they are American networks themselves. So if you look at United Cities and Local Governments, which is the most important and overreaching network of local governments in the world, there's hardly an American mayor to be found in there, and there's 2,000 mayors there. If you look at Metropolis, the World Association of Major Metropolis, where you have Berlin, Seoul, Mexico City, Montreal, Sao Paulo, I mean, it's a 30-year-old network. There's no American mayors to be found. So my question to you is, has the study looked into the belonging of, or the, I don't know the word is belonging, but the participation of American mayors beyond their own comfort zone of US-centered networking? Question one. Question two, is that perhaps going to change now that America First is a challenging statement for some mayors in the United States? And third, is the new frontier for city networks foreign policy?
Foreign policy?
Yeah, because mayors are now speaking about things that normally they didn't talk about You know, it's not only about urban issues anymore. Now we're talking about migration. Now we're talking about peace. We're talking about arms control, things that were, you know, in the realm of the national governments. And this might be a new frontier for some very high-profile mayors that want to speak outside of the United States.
Yeah, I suspect all of us have something to say in response to some of those questions. So I'll start. So we set out, there has been, the networks, the global networks have been better studied than the US networks. So one of the things we set out to do with this report was really specifically look, because we study US mayors, one of the things we set out to do was really understand the context and activity within the US. Half of the networks that we look at are really just focused on the US, and half actually are global. So someone like the Under 2 Coalition was created by, I'm gonna forget the state, Bonn, Germany, and
It's California.
and the state of California.
Yeah.
And then they happen to have cities that have come along because they want access to that knowledge sharing. So there are about half of the networks are similar to 100 Resilient Cities, C40, Under 2 Coalition. ICLA USA is the local chapter of a global organization. So in that sense, those cities are actually part of a global network. We really tried to understand the momentum and activity here because we talked to so many mayors. We were interested in what are you all signing on and why? You know, what are you signing on to, whether it's domestic or global? Your question about the sort of foreign policy, I think, is really interesting. And David could speak to the literature on when and why American mayors get reelected, right? And he would know better, but it's things like trash removal and snow removal and crime and public safety. And so to a certain extent, mayors here are always going to, and mayors everywhere are always going to be focused on sort of, as one mayor said, was minding their knitting at home, right? But really focus on how do you actually build a rich and vibrant place, and that's your core responsibility. And your participation in all these other things is really ultimately about improving that place and the quality of lives of the people for whom you're responsible. And so to the extent that they engage in some of these other foreign policy networks, I would argue it will be in areas where there are some benefits that construe back to their people, and or they get access to financing or something again, but where the benefits construe back to their own community. There is in the literature historically, mayors who are focused on nuclear proliferation. So there are networks, that existed at a time when those kinds of issues were really the hot issues and the headline-getting issues, and mayors were part of those conversations. So I would argue that actually a lot of that activity has been happening globally, but it felt newer to us when you look at American mayors and their participation in the networks. And then lastly, the sister cities comment. We tried to look at networks that are really policy specific, knowing that otherwise you're looking at the ICMA, National League of Cities, the US Conference of Mayors, Sister Cities International, the Global Parliament of Mayors, these networks that bring together cities domestically and globally that are not policy specific. And we really wanted to look at that sort of policy lens and policy priority focus. And then, did I miss? Okay, why do mayors get reelected? Did I get the right?
Yeah, I mean, city services, economic performance, jobs, things like that. But I would say, this is an intriguing question about signing on to more sort of foreign policy networks and things like that. And I think to the extent we see more of it, it would fit with this kind of signaling interpretation of what a lot of this is about, right? Because there's not going to be a lot of probably either tangible benefits, or it's kind of a long road to actual impact on foreign policy from a network sort of signatory at the local level. So it may be part of this kind of divide between where some networks really are about kind of tangible resources and collaboration and technical expertise and things like that. And there's another subset, which is more about kind of the collective voice and things like that. So as a kind of empirical marker of how much of that is going on, looking at a place where there really probably isn't going to be a lot of tangible resources or best practices sharing, for foreign policy development within cities or things like that, it'll be a nice way kind of in the real world to observe kind of how much of both types of sort of network joining behavior are going on.
So there are rumors, very weak signals right now that at least 2 current mayors and a former mayor will run in 2020 for their party's nomination. And when I look at the most networked cities, there's a remarkable overlap between those mayors in the most networked cities in the country. You're in a safe space for all friends here. When you ask the mayors, why do you join networks? Yes, do it for their collective good. They do it to signal to their constituents. But what if those constituents are national? Did any of them just say, I do it because it's good for me? Because I don't want to become a governor. I don't want to become a representative or a senator. This is a good national platform for me.
Sort of. Not quite. They don't say it about themselves. Other mayors say it about them. Okay. Not by name, but within the folks we talk to. There's a subset that are frankly more skeptical about some of and they're frequently probably lower joining cities. And some of them, would say it's, we ask why do other cities join policy networks, and that's where you get more of because it's good for their, it's good for their ambitions and various other sort of more, cynical or political or, the extreme end of kind of signaling and position taking, as we'd call it in political science. So there, within the community of mayors, those views exist, but you're more likely to hear them if you ask other mayors about some of their colleagues' joining behavior,
but
perhaps.
Cynical, but do you think of it as a factor, truly, as a factor in why they join networks, their own ambition?
Yeah, I mean, as a political scientist, yes, I think it's, it's partly, as I think Kathryn mentioned earlier, there are real, there's a natural fit between often the political constituency in cities and joining some of these networks. The cost, if you will, of joining in a 80% blue city is quite low, especially if it's another network that doesn't come with a lot of tangible costs or policy commitments or things like that might actually. So yeah, I think I don't think that's incompatible or mutually exclusive with good policy making and speaking on a collective voice about actual policy issues. I mean, I think they're frequently going to be mutually beneficial. But yes, as a sort of political scientist, this would fall in the category of things we expect would be a fit for politicians with a certain constituency and a relatively low cost of signing on and getting the picture and the membership and hopefully some real benefits to tout.
A small caveat up front, this is a bit conjecturing now, but in political science, they talk a lot about the sweet spot of interest groups in terms of size, in terms of representation, and the link to constituents. And I think it connects nicely with the question before. Why perhaps don't we see a lot of US American, again, it's not backed up by data we collected in this report, my opinion. Why don't we see a lot of American mayors in international climate networks? If this is true, and we see some evidence of this, it might be because they are one of 7,400. They're not one of 20, even though some of these networks allow for different leadership positions to be taken by mayors, but there's a kind of normal cost-benefit analysis and very pragmatic probably happening there. And the broader you go geographically, the more diluted it gets, the less direct benefits you can claim. So they're linked.
And for those who don't know, 7,400, the Global Covenant of Mayors, when the Compact of Mayors merged with the Covenant of Mayors, it went from a 120 city US network to a 7,400 city global network, which is a very different thing, arguably, to be a part of for a city. Yeah, not good or bad. It's not a value. It's different, substantively different.
Hi, back here. My name is Arthi Gunasekar, and I'm actually with the New York City Mayor's Office for International Affairs. So really great responses and relevant discussion, because often one of the things that we hear when asked to advise should New York City join an international network is the relevance, and does it bring the right peers to the table for my colleagues like Lolita, where, in a US context with the governance structures, there's a more fruitful discussion that 1 hour would give rather than an international conference circuit of sorts, sometimes that we feel that we get brought into. And I was wondering, you've talked a lot about what engages people to join networks, but often, at least on the international discussions that we've held, it's been easier to have dialogue in an informal way. And so did some cities or mayors you spoke with talk about, sometimes the time commitment, relevance, all those things of why perhaps we don't want to be a formal unit, but informally, sharing best practice on issues that are just going to be different from Paris to LA to, Boulder, Colorado is easier. Was there any discussion on that?
Any thoughts from the mayors themselves?
On
Sort of the informal networking. I mean, I think, we were regular attendees of the National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So I would say that the informal sharing of best practices and that camaraderie inevitably happens in the forums that maybe are not policy specific. All the networks we looked at have at least 2 annual convenings. Often mayors are part of that conversation. So that creates a space for them to come together informally. And then most of the peer-to-peer learning, where you see peer-to-peer learning indicated, that's a very formal process, whether that's a regular conference call for peers to sort of focus around a particular issue, or an online platform, knowledge sharing platform, and an online community where people can engage and talk with one another on the staff level. I think the informal, I suspect mayors don't join networks to benefit from the informal, because they all have so many, at least in this country, they have so many other, similar city managers, they have so many other outlets for informal engagement and relationship development.
But yeah, just to add to that a little, mostly to echo it, we have also talked to them, not necessarily in the context of networks, but of sort of policy learning and sharing more often. And you certainly get the impression pretty quickly that, one benefit of being at probably every event they get to go to is they know who they want to talk to about certain issues and who's kind of the go-to person on that. And to the extent being in more networks or being at a network conference where the right other mayors are there. I mean, they clearly have a pretty thoughtful sense of, who do I want to talk to about certain issues and things like that. So I think that's an absolute reality. It's something that, from the external perspective, it's harder to pick up, obviously, in the data. But I'm pretty confident, kind of, extrapolating beyond what we've seen and heard talking to them at USCM and NLC type meetings, that probably similar and even a more sort of issue-specific dynamics go on at, and are certainly a value and a motivating factor at and some of the other networks.
Perhaps one last comment on this one. The Under 2 Coalition is an interesting example where cities, and it's restricted, not every city can join, but cities get the informal access to state level legislators, politicians, governor's office, which and this also speaks to the question about, are there gaps in terms of composition of networks or activities? So the focus of this report was clearly on networks which have at least 50% cities being represented in their membership. But we saw clearly that this interaction between cities, especially large cities, and state level is a linkage which is not fully explored yet. We have the Eastern Canadian Governors Association and the Northeastern US governors. They have this on a regional level, but it's, again, specific on states. One way to go and to look for potential gaps might be this interface between cities and states.
I'll add one more thing. There's a subtext to informal influence, which is peer pressure, right? And one of the things we did hear more anecdotally is from the networks is the benefit of membership is it creates peer pressure. It exposes them to one another's ideas, and it exposes them to deficiencies, in what they're doing. I can't remember who, a network brought this up last week, was also, it exposes them to holes in their staff, where they say, I don't have anyone that does that. So most of the networks say you have to identify a staff member to work on the issues, but then if that's one staff member and then another city has 5 staff members, then they say, oh, got it, when I think about my operating budget, maybe I actually should think about my staffing model for that array of issues. So I think that's another way that informal pressure, that sort of informal relationship manifests, is that peer pressure and the I want what they have, and I don't know what I don't know, right, until I see it somewhere else, and then I realize that there's a gap in how I'm making decisions or how I'm running my city or how I'm doing my planning. Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll break. No, yeah, Ben.
Hey, Ben Siegel. Can you hear me? Okay. Ben Siegel, Johns Hopkins University. Curious if you were able to explore at all the kind of comparison between why mayors are joining these networks and why the founders or the funders of the networks themselves want the mayors to join. Is it compatible? Did you find differences? Did you even look at that?
I mean, I'm struck by the funders are funding organizations based on their activities, right, and what they do and what they promise to deliver. And I think I was struck by the degree to which why mayors say they join is pretty well reflected in the activities and benefits that are available through the networks. I think one area that mayors didn't say was a huge issue, and what you find, only half of networks provided is direct financial assistance. So that's probably good news for funders, that they aren't saying I join because I get access to this new pot of money or this new sort of capital resource. So that's one area where there could have easily been a mismatch, and for the most part there wasn't. Most networks don't offer financial resources, and mayors weren't saying that was a real priority. It's a good question. We didn't interview foundations. We didn't interview the Rockefeller Foundation, which supports 100 resilient cities. We didn't interview foundations to say, what's your motivation in underwriting the networks? We did find that most of the networks are dependent on philanthropic dollars, that for the most part, they were created not with private sector resources, and they don't operate with membership dues. They really are dependent on satisfying their funders. Which is also one of the reasons that they focus on advocacy, not lobbying. They're not lobbying organizations. They are advocating on behalf of their members with other levels of government. But that as a funding source, they value because it allows for a certain degree of neutrality. And we did hear from some of them that they were created actually because they didn't want private sector money at the table, because they wanted that degree of neutrality. To do things that were in the best interest of their members without having sort of responsibility or accountability to someone else. Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap up. I want to make two final closing comments. First, thank you to everybody. Thank you to David. Thank you to Nick. Thank you, Graham. Looks like Jamie ran out. Thank you, Ryan. Two observations, which you can choose to take advantage of or not act on, but I want to make sure they're said. One is, it is incredible to interview the networks, and it was remarkable to hear the rigor, the thoughtfulness, the array and diversity of activities and things that people are experimenting with. It could not possibly all make its way into the report. At the same time, people are not sitting down and talking about their operational models. And they're particularly not sitting down and talking about their operational models across policy areas. And so one thing that, this is an observation, take it or leave it, one thing that really struck us is there's this real opportunity, if you all wanted to actually get together and bring the operational experts together from various networks and say, what has worked? Where have we been effective? What hasn't worked? What have we tried? Do you use online tools, offline tools? What do best practices look like? Particularly when you're not in the same policy area, it's really remarkable to think about Welcoming America's model and everything they've learned and what C40 might learn from the work that they've been doing. So just a suggestion. The second thing is, we sit at a university, and as I said at the beginning, we work with so many faculty who are deeply passionate about all the issues that networks are trying to address. And yet, we were struck by the fact that the networks do not have scientific advisory panels, academic resources, sort of resident experts and fellows from academia. And we think it's a real opportunity. There are people who are hungry to bring you the best evidence on urban climate mitigation, on inclusive policies, on reducing gun violence. I know I have them at BU. They're inevitably everywhere across the country. So this is just a call, a request for all of you to really think about who else you're bringing into the fold. And I really think that universities are an underutilized resource. And with that, thank you and have a beautiful day.
Thank you.